Chapter 31. Helios. Riley waved at him. Maisie wasn't surprised. She knew that Riley's aunt was the wife of Mr. Boucher, who was also Helios' mother. "It's been a while, Riley. Is this your friend?" Riley held her arm and said, "My best friend." "Why are you here?" Nolan stared at Helios impatiently. Helios smiled and said, "I'm here to meet this lady." He was referring to Maisie. Maisie was surprised. Did the best actor just say that he wanted to meet her? Nolan didn't reply, but his eyes turned darker. Helios ignored Nolan, walked toward Maisie, and extended an invitation like a gentleman. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" Riley's eyes shone with pride. Helios had great taste. Maisie was stunned. She looked toward the killing stares of the other socialites. If she accepted this dance, she would probably be eliminated by the socialites and their fans. Riley gave her a nudge from the back, and Maisie was mercilessly shoved in front of Helios. Helios caught Riley's gaze and smiled. "Good job, girl." Maisie turned her head around and gave her a hard glare. This girl was best at selling out her teammates. Helios held Maisie's hand, and right when he was leading her away, someone tugged on her other hand. She turned around, surprised. It was Nolan. Riley's expression was absolutely interesting. She almost took out a chair and started having popcorn then and there. The onlookers also started whispering among themselves when they saw this. Maisie, who was planning to lay low, immediately became the showstopper of the party. What was she supposed to do when the two big players of Bassburg were holding on to her at the same time? Helios scoffed and said, "Mr. Goldman, you're not trying to steal her away, are you?" Nolan kept calm and said, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to dance with her." Helios squinted, lifted the corners of his lips, and said, "I think it's a good idea." "Who do you pick?" They spoke at the same time while shooting daggers at each other. The helpless Maisie was stuck between the best actor and a man who had given her $150 million. She couldn't defend either of them. Upon recalling that something was going on between Nolan and Willow, and since the host of the night was Helios' father, it was their party, she had to show them some respect. Thus, she shook off Nolan's hand and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Goldman." Nolan's gaze turned cold while he watched Maisie walk out with Helios. He must have lost his mind to hold on to her. The music started playing. Helios and Maisie started waltzing under the lights. A handsome man and a beautiful woman shone brightly among the crowd. Helios looked around. He couldn't help but curl his lips and get close to her. "Do you know Mr. Goldman N?" Maisie said disapprovingly, "I guess so. He offered $150 million to get me to work at Vena Jewelry. But why do I think he looks at you differently?" Helios smiled politely. Maisie lifted her head and looked at him. "Your eyes must have played tricks on you." Helios scoffed. "Ms. Zora is so humorous." Maisie just smiled and said, "Thanks." Nolan's eyes followed them around, watching them enjoying their conversation. His face turned dark, and the atmosphere around him dropped a few degrees. "Did you see that beauty who's dancing with Mr. Boucher? She has such a great body. I would do anything to spend a night with a woman like her." Chapter 32. The men in the crowd were staring at Maisie's curvaceous body. When men looked at women, they would usually start at their bodies and move toward the face. Who wouldn't like a woman with a great body and a pretty face? However, right after that man said that, he shuddered because he felt a pair of eyes on him. The stare seemed to have come from where Mr. Goldman was standing. After the dance ended, a round of applause erupted. Maisie walked away from the crowd in a hurry while trying to find Riley. Suddenly, someone held on to her. She turned around, and she was standing right in front of Nolan. "You." Before she could finish, swoosh, a jacket covered her from the top. Maisie took off his jacket and doubtfully asked, "What is this supposed to mean? Put it on." Nolan sounded a little commanding. Maisie smiled. But this is how this gown looks, why should I? Nolan suddenly pushed her behind some curtains, putting one hand on the wall and holding her close with the other. Who are you trying to seduce, wearing that? Doesn't this woman know how many men were staring at her? Maisie raised a finger and poked his shoulder. Mr. Goldman, there are plenty of women who are in dresses that show off their figures. Why don't you go and talk to them instead of just doing this to me? A woman's choice of clothing should be her freedom. Why should men get involved? On top of that, didn't all gowns look about the same? Stop arguing, just keep that on. Nolan gnashed his teeth. I don't. Nolan lowered his head and got closer. I can help you put it on if you don't mind. Maisie shuddered from the sudden proximity. Her lashes fluttering like butterfly wings. The man's body was as stable as a volcano. The temperature rose quickly in the small space behind the curtains. Seeing her lightly biting her lips, Nolan gulped while his chin tightened. Maisie's hands started to sweat. This annoying man was standing too close. Was he planning to? She suddenly held onto the jacket, wrapped it around herself tightly, and pushed him away. I'll put it on. You don't have to get so close. I don't want people to misunderstand the situation. Then she turned around and walked away. Nolan pursed his thin lips, and his eyes darkened. He had been so close to impulsively giving her a passionate kiss. This woman was a dangerous poison. Maisie walked through the crowd angrily, with Nolan's jacket wrapped around her. When Riley saw her, she walked toward her. Hey, isn't this Mr. Goldman's jacket? Z's wearing Mr. Goldman's jacket? Oh no, is something going on? Maisie flicked her forehead. Stop with the naughty thoughts. Honestly, you're the winner of the night, Mr. Goldman on one side, my cousin on the other. The two biggest players of Bassburg were fighting for you. That's a scene straight from a romance flick. Seeing that Riley was getting immersed in her fantasy, Maisie stared at her. Stop dreaming. I wonder if my godchildren would. Riley suddenly seemed to have remembered something. Her expression froze as she looked at Maisie and said, Hey, Z. I suddenly realized that Waylon and Colton look exactly like Mr. Goldman. She started panicking. Could the man you spent the night with 6 years ago be Mr. Goldman? Riley's words made Maisie's face freeze. She had been shocked when she saw Nolan for the first time. He really looked a lot like Waylon and Colton. What was freakier was that his cologne smelled exactly like the one the man from 6 years ago had had on. Chapter 33. If he really was the man from 6 years ago, Maisie's eyes suddenly turned cold. Willow had arranged everything on the night she was tainted. She had even brought in that man. But if Nolan was the man Willow had gotten to destroy her, he would have known about her. Furthermore, she wouldn't believe that Willow would send a man like him to her bed. She probably would have kept him for herself. Seeing that she wasn't responding, Riley asked, Z, don't you think so? Even if it really was him. Do you think a man that Willow used would be a man fit to be my children's father? Maisie asked rhetorically. Riley was rendered speechless. That was an awesome statement. In Zlokova, only Z would have the guts to think that Mr. Goldman wasn't good enough. Maisie's phone started buzzing. When she saw that it was Colton, she left the hall in a hurry after saying something to Riley. She answered the phone in the corridor. Colton? Mommy, Waylon asked me to check if we should keep some supper for you. Just in case you got hungry after drinking. Alright, I'm coming back now, wait for me. Maisie smiled warmly. She was content with having 3 angels who were always by her side. She turned around and immediately saw Nolan standing behind her. She didn't know how long he had been there. Had he overheard? Is your boyfriend asking you to go back already? Nolan asked coolly. Maisie shrugged. Can't help it, I can't stop him from worrying. After saying that, she suddenly remembered something. She removed his jacket and gave it back to him. Thanks for the jacket. Nolan didn't take it back. Instead, he looked down and calmly said, "I'll send you back." He wanted to see what her man looked like. Maisie was stunned, but she kept her astonishment hidden. "I must have misheard. You want to send me home? Is there a problem with that?" "No, but I wouldn't want to bother you. If the one at home saw it, he would probably be jealous." She pushed the jacket into his arms, turned around, and tried to leave. Nolan suddenly walked in front of her. "You don't want to bother me, or do you not want me to send you back?" Maisie smirked. "Mr. Goldman, I'm shocked by your sudden concern about me." "Concern?" Nolan's eyes couldn't help but turn cold. "You're thinking too highly of yourself." Why would he be concerned about her? That wasn't possible. Maisie raised her brows and walked toward him. "No, you have a girlfriend, but you're trying to send another woman home. People might think that you have intentions." Nolan's thin lips turned into a thin line. He tried to say something, but Helios showed up. He still had a friendly smile on. "You're leaving already?" Maisie shrugged. "Someone is waiting for me at home, I have to get back." "Do you want me to get my driver to send you home?" "It's dangerous for a girl to go home alone at night." Helios smiled. Maisie was going to accept the offer, but Nolan stopped her. "I'll send her back." He turned around and dragged Maisie along without giving her a chance to say no. Helios' lips curled as he watched Nolan bring Maisie away. Nolan's attitude toward her was indeed astonishing. When they got to the car, Maisie shook off his hand. "Mr. Goldman, could you be reasonable? I said I don't need you to send me." Chapter 34. What was wrong with this man? Nolan opened the car door and said in a somewhat commanding voice, "I'm not going to have a discussion, get in." Maisie laughed. She had seen women who were unreasonable, but never men. She got in the car with a stoic expression. When Nolan asked for her address, Maisie hesitated and seemed to have thought of something. "Just stop at the crossroads of Oceana Drive." So, she wasn't going to let him send her all the way to her front door. Nolan slightly frowned. "Oceana Drive? Isn't that where the villas by the beach are?" Nolan stopped at the crossroads of Oceana Drive. After Maisie got off, she said thanks and left. Nolan didn't leave immediately. He had his eyes on the direction she was headed. That really was the beach villa area. Maisie walked into the beach villa area. She was careful and kept walking when she got to her villa, instead of going in. Nolan stopped his car just outside the beach villa area while watching the silhouette walk further in. His expression slightly tensed. It seemed like he was overthinking. He didn't expect that she was living in the same area as the two children. After Nolan drove off, Maisie appeared from behind a wall. "Did this man really want to see where I live?" Maisie walked through her home door. "I'm back." Colton shushed her and looked toward Daisy, who was sleeping on the couch. "Mommy, Daisy just fell asleep." Maisie walked to the couch and carried Daisy, who was fast asleep inside. After tucking her in, she left the room and saw Waylon leave a bowl of hot soup on the table. She couldn't help but smile. "Good job, big brother." Colton climbed onto the chair and sat there with his cheeks in his hands. "Mommy, was the party that godmother invited you to fun?" Waylon smacked his lips and said, "What is fun about parties? They're just full of bootlickers for the upper class." Maisie looked up at him. "Where did you hear that from?" "That's how they show it in TV shows." Children shouldn't be watching too many TV shows. Maisie felt helpless knowing that they were going to be poisoned by the TV shows. Colton said unhappily, "But Paw Patrol and Coco Melon are so childish." What else could she have said? She had to deal with the children she gave birth to. By the way, Mommy, Waylon, and Daisy are going to debut. After hearing that, Maisie looked at Waylon in shock. "You're going to debut with Daisy?" "Don't worry, Mommy, we can help you earn some money when we debut. Since we're going to start school soon, we'll be able to pay for our own school fees." Maisie put down her spoon and looked at the two attentively. "Do you think that I can't afford to raise you?" The two shook their heads. "Exactly, I don't need that extra money. Mommy, you do look like you don't need extra money, but you don't have a lot either. The villa alone cost $600,000. Waylon and Daisy are going to a school for elites that costs $150,000 a year. Music school is expensive too. On top of that, there are our daily expenses, the car, you need to get bags, clothes, makeup, all that is going to cost a few $100,000. Colton ran out of fingers for calculation. Maisie was rendered speechless. Colton tilted his head and said without holding back, Mommy, you're poor. Maisie put a hand to her chest. That cut straight to her heart. She slowly forced a smile. It's all right. I still have $150 million left. Chapter 35. $150 million isn't enough for you to burn. Maisie was rendered speechless. Colton hung his little head. And it's tough for you to bring in money and take care of us, you don't have a man to take care of you, so we wanted to share your burden. Waylon nodded. Seeing that they were so mature at such a young age, Maisie was torn between being glad and sad. She had been trying hard to give them the best life they could get even though they didn't have a father. She wasn't going to let people look down on them. Maisie knew that her children were mature. She didn't have to worry much, but she wished that they would complain to her sometimes. It would make her feel better. She looked down and smiled with a quiet sigh. All right, I know you're trying to help. But getting into the entertainment business is too risky. Let's talk about it when you're older. You're still young. That's not a good place for you to be in. The entertainment business was always a tricky place, and Waylon and Daisy were so young people might manipulate them. All right, it's bedtime, children should sleep early. Maisie got up and patted our heads. Colton and Waylon returned to their rooms, closed the door, and climbed into their beds for a secret discussion. Waylon, Mommy disapproves. Waylon put a hand to his chin. Pretending to be in deep thought like a grown-up, Mommy seems to be worried that Daisy and I will be bullied when we get into the entertainment business because no one will have our backs. Colton agreed. He seemed to have thought of an idea and said with a cheeky smile. What if we get to know the top player in the business? Are you talking about Helios Boucher? Yes. Colton smiled happily. But we'll need the help of our silly godmother. Although they still couldn't say who their father was. They could get a godfather who was just as cool as their father. And in Zlokova, Helios would be that person. They say it's not about what you know, but who you know. If you know enough big players, you'll be able to fly. Advena Jewelry, a blonde, middle-aged man with shades and a gray trench coat walked into the company. Even though the man was in his 40s, he was still fit with a distinguished air that made employees' heads turn. The floor that he was headed to was where the designer Zora's office was on. The man entered the office. Maisie turned her chair around and stood up, smiling. Uncle Kendi. Kendi took off his shades and looked at her with slight surprise. You're Z? Yes, that's me. Maisie nodded. Kennedy happily walked up to her and took a good look. I haven't seen you in so many years, you're looking more and more like your mother. After half an hour, the two sat on the couch and drank coffee. Maisie informed him about the situation in Vena, and he looked stoic. Vena was the jewelry company founded by your mother. I had been handling it since her passing. I never thought your father would let someone who doesn't know anything about jewelry like Willow handle the company 6 years ago. He took a sip of his coffee and hummed. Your father wanted me to guide her, but I refused. How would Vena shine under someone like that? That's why I invited you back. Maisie smiled. Since I'm back in Vena, I'm going to get it back, no matter what I have to do. Chapter 36. Kennedy looked up. But your father already gave the shares to Willow. It's going to be hard to get her to give them up, and on top of that, that person is behind her. That person was Mr. Goldman. Maisie's lips curled. I've been observing their relationship ever since I returned. Even if Nolan is protecting Willow, how long would he be able to do that for? What do you mean? Nolan and Willow have been together for 6 years, but he has no intentions of marrying her. Even though I don't know the reason, one thing is possible to conclude. Maisie's eyes slightly turn cold. He's not keen on the idea of marrying Willow, which means he's not planning on marrying her. Willow can only stick to him for a short time. It wouldn't be hard for Nolan to find a woman who's better than her. It's just a matter of time for me to take back the shares of Venna from Willow. Kennedy knew her words were true, but he was still worried. There's no guarantee to this. What if Mr. Goldman does marry her in the future? If Willow became Mrs. Goldman, she would be in a different class. It would be impossible to get the shares back from her then. The Goldmans should have a higher standard than that, to be able to be Mrs. Goldman. The girl probably needs to be a few classes higher than us, Vanderbilts. Probably the heir of a huge corporation or royalty. Kennedy looked confused. Mr. Goldman had never mentioned those requirements. They weren't trying to pick a queen. Why did she sound agitated? Like she was the one who was picking a wife for Mr. Goldman? Alright, let's not worry about this just yet. The issue about time that I mentioned is to build my own jewelry brand in a short period. Kennedy was shocked. You could do that in a short time? She looked up and smiled. Yes, but what if I could get people in the board of directors to think that this title belongs to me? The board believes that Mr. Goldman is behind Willow. In their minds, Willow is the best person for that title. The board of directors had let Willow off because Stephen had given all the shares to her and because Mr. Goldman was backing her up. If it were another company, a senior executive that was as useless as she would have been kicked out of the board of directors. Other than bringing a man in, what other benefits could she bring to the table? Venna has been suffering losses. Would Nolan be willing to pay to cover the hole and support people who are not under his company? If that's the case, I don't want to work anymore either. I'll be happy being paid for nothing. Maisie couldn't wait to just wake up with money in her bank every day. 1. Kennedy laughed. That's true, but what do you plan to do? Maisie pushed a document in front of him. He was shocked after reading it. You're trying to get a partnership with Taylor. Taylor Jewelry was the biggest jewelry company in Zlokova. It was bigger than Venna and any other jewelry company. Taylor Jewelry had an international market. It stood at the peak of the fashion jewelry industry along with Luxella and Majestic from Staslo. International models would wear jewelry from these 3 big brands on the runway. If Taylor partnered up with Venna, Venna would be able to have a breakthrough in reputation in Zlokova. That would be equal to having Taylor as their face from then on. Chapter 37. The benefits that could bring to Venna were obvious. Taylor Jewelry has tough requirements. They wouldn't be interested in any jewelry company. Why would they agree to work with Venna? Maisie smiled. Don't worry about that, I have a plan. Layla walked into the company with her branded bag like an upper-class lady. All the employees knew that she was Willow's mother, so they called her Mrs. Chairman. However, just when she was happily going to meet Willow to find out if her plan for the other night had worked out, she saw Maisie and a blonde man getting off the elevator while enjoying a conversation. Her gaze turned fierce. Oh, you're bringing men you seduce all the way to the office now? Kennedy's face dropped. When he tried to say something, Maisie held up a hand to stop him. She smiled at Layla and said, How would I be better than you when it comes to seducing men? How dare you talk back? Layla angrily raised her hand. Slap. The slap rang through the walkway. Maisie's face was slightly turned, a red mark appearing. Before Kennedy could react, Maisie's quick hand landed on Layla's face. The slap made her fall to the floor. Layla held her face that was in pain while looking shocked. The burn on Maisie's palm could show how much strength she had put into it. Remembering the red print on Daisy's face and looking at Layla's face at that moment, she believed she had avenged Daisy. How dare you hit me? I don't like to be on the losing end. You slapped me first. The slap was just a return. Maisie's smile was cold. Just when she was leaving with Kennedy, she saw Nolan and Willow walking over. 1. Seeing that her mother was on the floor, Willow worriedly helped her up. What happened, Mom? Layla kept saying how much it hurt. When Willow saw the palm print on her face, she immediately walked to Maisie and questioned her. Z, how could you slap my mom? Even if you don't like her, you can't just hit people. Ms. Vanderbilt. You should check the surveillance footage before saying that. Maisie pointed at the cameras outside the elevators that were pointed at them. When Layla saw the cameras, her face changed. Willow looked at her mother. That wasn't good. Her mother must have said something which made Maisie slap her, and it was right under the cameras. But, even if my mom said something terrible, you can't just assault someone. You've made up your mind that I started it before even checking the footage? Are you blindly helping your mom instead of looking at the evidence? Maisie smiled and looked at Nolan, who was expressionless. Does Mr. Goldman think we should check the surveillance footage? Willow and Layla were in trouble. Nolan noticed that there was still a mark on her face. His eyes turned dark, and he said, "There's no need for that." He was able to guess what had happened without having to check. Maisie shrugged and turned to Kennedy. Uncle Kennedy, let's go. We shouldn't let our clients wait. Kennedy nodded. Willow stopped her. Z. Which client are you meeting? As if she was trying to put up a good performance in front of Nolan, she walked toward Maisie with a smile. Why not let me talk to the clients? I want to learn from you. Chapter 38. Maisie turned around and looked at her. Are you sure? If she went to meet Taylor Jewelry by herself, there might still be a little hope, but if Willow went, she probably wouldn't even get to meet them. Willow smiled. I can't let you do everything while I do nothing. Maisie sniggered in her heart. Her hunger for knowledge was so strong just because she wanted to be on Nolan's good side. All right. Z. Kennedy wanted to say something, but Maisie had already handed the agreement to her. That's the partnership proposal with Taylor Jewelry. Thank you for doing this. Nolan frowned, and his lips turned into a thin line. Willow was happy that Maisie was really willing to give her agreement to her. If she could close the deal, Nolan would look at her in a different light. If this woman was going to pass on the opportunity, she couldn't blame her. Maisie walked back to her office alone. A deep voice came from behind her. You knew that she wasn't going to close the deal with Taylor Jewelry. Why did you agree to let her go? Maisie stopped in her tracks, turned around to look at Nolan, smiled, and said, You were there too, didn't you hear that she wanted to go? I didn't force her. Nolan's eyes darkened. He went up to her and held her wrist. You can stop pretending. You're feeling bad for her just for a small matter? Maisie struggled a little, but didn't manage to shake him off. She bit her teeth and said, Mr. Goldman, since you're feeling bad and know that she's walking into a dead end, why didn't you stop her just now? Nolan didn't answer. She continued. Since you didn't stop her, why are you blaming me now? It wasn't possible for Nolan not to know about Taylor. If he knew, he would know that Willow would be stonewalled. Even if Willow said she was Nolan's girlfriend, they might still ignore her. If he didn't stop her, why was he putting the blame on Maisie now? What do you want? Maisie hesitated and looked at him. I want Vanna. To get the shares from her? Nolan said calmly. She didn't bother to pretend. Yes. Nolan looked at how carefree this woman was. He squinted a little and said, I can give that to you. What? Maisie was startled. She was surprised. Did she imagine that? Nolan got closer to her. I can give you something that's even more attractive than shares, but you have to give up the shares of Vanna for it. Maisie's face froze upon hearing that. She sniggered. I'm not interested in anything other than shares of Vena, even if it's $150 million. Nolan scoffed. Maisie, you need to be smart, you won't get any of the shares if I don't agree to it. Are you trying to say that you're going to try and stop me? Maisie's eyes darkened. He was already protecting her even when they weren't married yet. If they really did get married, Willow was probably going to do a river dance on her head. I don't need to try. Given your status and capability, why would you care about this? He paused, sounding cold. If you're willing to give up on the shares of Vena, I'll give you a new jewelry company. Maisie looked at him. You want me to give my mother's company to an unrelated person, why? Nolan's eyes were calm. Your father has already taken all the shares from the company that your mother founded. According to the law, this company belongs to Stephen. Your mother is no longer in the picture. Chapter 39. Maisie's eyes darted around, her expression slowly calming down. Father has taken all of mother's shares? Why, it was shared equity, and they were mother's shares, why were they taken? I don't believe you. Maisie gnashed her teeth. Why don't you ask your father? Seeing her eyes losing hope, Nolan somehow felt concerned. He had looked into every detail of the Vanderbilts and was clear about Vena's predicament. He hadn't known that the late wife of Stephen founded Vena. He had started looking into them when Maisie came back. Marina had started Vena with Stephen, but since her demise, all the shares had gone to Stephen instead of him helping Maisie keep her mother's shares. Willow only had this company because Stephen had given it to her. She was not as capable nor talented as Maisie. Nolan was a little selfish when it came to getting Maisie out of Vena. Maybe it would be better for him to investigate if he kept her close. Maisie shook off his hand with a serious expression. She rubbed her wrist and turned around. Mr. Goldman, you may leave if there's nothing further to talk about. You'll come to me. Nolan left after saying that. Maisie walked to her desk, picked up the phone, and dialed a number. Mr. Zidane, I'm Maisie. I'd like to know more about my mother's will. Willow happily went to Taylor for their meeting, but she was stonewalled. She didn't know how important Taylor jewelry was in Zlokova, so she acted as such. I'm Mr. Goldman's girlfriend. Treating me like this just means that you're disrespecting Mr. Goldman. Given the influence the Goldmans had in Zlokova, she wasn't afraid. Mr. Goldman and his influence, does that mean anyone can throw a fit in my place in his name? Among a few bodyguards that were walking toward them, an old woman with gray hair in an elegant emerald dress was pushed out on a wheelchair. She was wearing priceless rosewood rosary beads on her hand. Even though she was old, one could tell that she was a beauty of her time. Even though she was in a wheelchair, one could still feel how commanding she was. You're just a little jewelry company. If I want to work with you, it's because we can see your potential. Willow held her arrogance. The old woman laughed with a fierceness in her eyes. Which company sent this ignorant employee over? Why didn't you do a bit of research before coming over and see who we Taylor Jewelry are first? An employee went to the old lady and said something. She waved him off impatiently. What is Vena? I've never heard of them. Get the security to escort her out. You wouldn't dare. I'm Mr. Goldman's girlfriend. The old lady looked fierce. Get Mr. Goldman to come then, see if he will give this old woman some respect, throw her out. A few security guards appeared and forcefully took Willow outside. Willow was fuming after being thrown out of Taylor. She should have let Maisie come over. She must have framed her for this. Maisie had been aware that this was going to fail, so she had let her come instead. No way. She was going to repay this humiliation one day. At Vanderbilt Manor, Maisie sped home with the document, ignoring Layla, who was in the living room. Chapter 40. Seeing that Maisie ignored her, Layla blocked her. What are you doing? Get out of the way. Maisie pushed her aside, ignoring the people who were talking behind her, and went straight to the study. She slammed the documents on the desk. Stephen was shocked at her actions. And his face sank. How dare you come back? Do you think I want to come back here? I came to ask you something. Maisie held the document. What happened to my mother's shares? Stephen was stunned. He didn't think she would ask about this. Seeing that Stephen was quiet, Maisie continued. My mother founded Vena, and it shared equity with you. Why would her shares become yours when she passed? Are you questioning me? Stephen raised his voice. Layla, who was eavesdropping outside, was wondering why Maisie came to see Stephen. But when she heard arguments, she was glad. That's right, the worse the argument between the two of you, the better. Give me a good explanation then. Maisie kept her interrogative tone. Stephen slammed his hands on the table. I'm your father. That wasn't what you said 6 years ago. Maisie's eyes were cloudy. When you kicked me out, did you really think I was still your daughter? Stephen clenched his jaw but didn't answer. I kept thinking, why would you let an outsider run my mother's company? Turns out you've taken over all the shares, even all the property that Vena owns. My mother was never mentioned. Maisie's eyes were red, but she suddenly burst out laughing. Now that I think of it, if you really did love my mother, you wouldn't have had a mistress and even made a child out of wedlock. Slap. Stephen's slap fell hard on her cheek. Maisie's face slightly turned, her hair a little messy. The red print on her face was brighter than the one that Layla had left. If you still think of me as your father, stop questioning. Stephen gnashed his teeth. Seeing the coldness on her father's face, not even showing the guilt he felt about her mother, Maisie was absolutely disappointed. She nodded, not able to stop a tear from rolling down her cheek. She smiled. I'm no longer related to the Vanderbilts. I can't take out the blood in me, but I'm now an outsider. You. Maisie took the document, turned, and left the study. She opened the door and bumped into Layla, who was standing outside, and left. Layla pretended to worry. Dear, is Z all right? Ignore her. Stephen sat down. The palm that had slapped her curled into a fist. Maisie sat in the car. The tears that she had been holding back started rolling down her cheeks. She sucked it up, wiped her tears off, started the engine, and left Vanderbilt Manor. At a cafe, Riley was shocked that Waylon and Colton had invited her for some coffee. However, she felt that these two rascals were up to no good. Colton, Waylon, do you need my help with something? She asked, straight to the point, and took a sip of her coffee. Godmother, my brother and sister are going into showbiz. That's why we wanted your help. Riley choked on her coffee. After a few coughs, she calmed down, looked at Waylon, and said, you want to join the entertainment business with Daisy?